Welcome back to the O&O Show. I'm your host, Colton Fetter. On deck this week for the O&O Show, we have, of course, our weekly news, the return of the Superlative series, and our first season preview for the 2024 season. If you follow O&O Sports on Twitter, you know who that preview is going to be of. So be sure to follow us on Twitter at O&O Sports. And let's get right into the news. First up, we have some transfer portal commitments. Running back Damian Martinez transfers from Oregon State to Miami. Miami adds a workhorse in Damian Martinez, who had almost 200 carries last year for 1,100 yards, 9 touchdowns, and 6.1 yards a carry. Next, we have former Colorado running back Dylan Edwards, who was a true freshman last year. Started at Colorado, kind of played a dual running back and wide receiver hybrid role. He transfers to Kansas State. Last year, he had 768 all-purpose yards and 5 total touchdowns. And over 150 of those total yards and 4 of those touchdowns came in the season opener against TCU. So Kansas State adds a dynamic weapon in Dylan Edwards. Wide receiver Keandre Lambert-Smith transfers from Penn State to Auburn. This is great news if you're Hugh Freeze. The wide receiver room, like we've talked about in previous episodes, was not deep. Very limited options there. They add an automatic wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 in Lambert-Smith. Last season at Penn State, he had 53 receptions for 673 yards, 4 touchdowns, and over 12.7 yards per reception. That is a great addition for a team like Auburn, who desperately needed a wide receiver. And next, a bit of a surprise, freshman quarterback from Arizona State, Jaden Rashada, transfers to Georgia. In 2023, he appeared in 3 games, had 53.7% completion percentage for over 480 yards, 4 touchdowns, just 3 interceptions with a 23.6 QBR. Not the best stats, obviously, but he still is a young quarterback. And what's interesting about that is they, of course, have Gunnar Stockton and Ryan Puglisi in there coming in as freshmen. I believe Gunnar Stockton's going to be a redshirt sophomore, actually. So it'll be interesting to see in the next year or so who separates themselves as the future quarterback for Georgia. As we know, Carson Beck has that locked up. This year he returns for Georgia. And wide receiver Sam Brown actually commits to Miami from Houston yesterday. He was one of Houston's primary receiving threats. He had over 60 receptions for 815 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 13 yards per reception. If you want to stay up to date on future transfer commitments, be sure to follow us at O&O Sports on Twitter for live updates. Up next to the news, Reggie Bush wins the Heisman again. Of course, Reggie Bush was forced to vacate his Heisman Trophy 14 years ago in 2010 for accepting gifts at USC. And earlier this week, the NCAA actually chose to return the Heisman Trophy after a long 14-year battle for Reggie Bush. Bush, of course, is in the middle of a defamation lawsuit versus the NCAA, which he will not drop despite getting the trophy back. But this is a big win for Bush, obviously, since NIL has grown as a device used in college football. It has been argued that Reggie Bush deserves his Heisman back, and before that, it had been argued that he should get his Heisman Trophy back, and now he has it. Congratulations, Reggie Bush. Next up in the news, we have new rules that are being implemented for the 2024 college football season. The first of which is the 2-minute warning, and it'll work the same way as it does in the NFL. With 2 minutes left in each half, there will be a timeout, so teams will gain an extra timeout. We will have to see how much of an impact this has on the sport, as it's not particularly important. The most important of the rule changes is earpiece communication will be allowed for one player on each unit of the offense and defense to talk directly with the head coach and coordinators. This, of course, comes in the midst of the sign stealing scandal, which has not been completely resolved as of right now, April 29th. The national champion Michigan Wolverines were accused of sign stealing earlier in the 2023 season. Of course, we know Jim Harbaugh got suspended for 3 games, and this was a big point of contention for college football fans who believe that earpiece communication should have been implemented much sooner, and thankfully for them, now it is. For the players, the communication will be cut off with either 15 seconds left on the play clock or when the ball is snapped, either or, whichever one comes first. So traditional signing to the players will probably still play a large role in the sport, but helmet communication will be introduced next season. Up next, the return of Superlative Series. In this edition, we will be talking about fire starters. Now, what is a fire starter? These are going to be potential chaos teams in college football for the year 2024. And a chaos team could mean a few different things. I will explain what each means depending on the team. Coming up first, we have the SMU Mustangs. Now in 2023, the Mustangs were in the American Conference. They went 11-3 overall, and they were undefeated in the conference and won their conference title. They jumped from the AAC to the ACC in 2024. Now, if you're looking at trends, you can see teams that jump from the Group of 5 to the Power 5 level usually don't have that great of a season in their first inaugural season. But if you look at their roster, last year they had the 34th ranked roster in pure talent, according to 24/7 Sports, which would be 6th in the ACC above teams like Georgia Tech and incoming Stanford, NC State, as well as other ACC teams. And they portal in a lot of depth. They bring in defensive lineman Jared Harrison Hunt from Miami, offensive lineman Savion Byrd from Oklahoma, Deuce Harmon, a defensive back from Texas A&M, Jonathan Jefferson, a defensive lineman from Georgia, and Ashton Cozart, a wide receiver from Oregon. All of those players are likely going to be instant impact players, maybe not all starters, but likely to receive some kind of immediate role with the Mustangs. And the biggest thing to me is they returned their quarterback Preston Stone. He went out late last season with a leg injury. And in those 12 games he played every regular season game. He had over 3,300 yards, 32 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions with a 71.3 QBR. And he was only a sophomore. And for a sophomore, he played relatively mistake-free football. We will have to wait to see how that translates to the Power 5 level. But he is not a quarterback that's going to make bad decisions. And he's going to be extremely underrated going into 2024. He's going to be a guy you want to keep your eye out for. Depending on how well he adjusts, which I assume will be good because he has a few years in the system, he's not going to be completely unfamiliar. He could make a next step and become a top guy in the conference, but we will have to see how he adjusts to the ACC. And for the 2024 schedule, at home, SMU will have Houston Christian, an FCS school, BYU, TCU, Florida State, Pitt, Boston College, and Cal. They get the brunt of their schedule at home. That Florida State game, TCU, they're going to get both of those teams at home, which might end up being key for SMU. If they can pull off one or two upsets, especially against a team like Florida State, they could be a sleeper contender in the ACC. And their away schedule is Nevada, Louisville, Stanford, Duke, and Virginia. Not all that bad. Louisville, of course, will be tough. They return a lot of talent, and they are portaling in a lot of talent. So SMU is a bit of a sleeper team here. They're going to be underrated just because of the jump they're making from the Group of 5 to the Power 5, but they have a lot of the tools necessary to pull off a couple upsets and maybe, just maybe, compete for the ACC, which would be interesting, and I don't think a lot of people see that coming, which is why they are a fire starter. Up next, we have the Wisconsin Badgers. Now, Wisconsin had a bit of an identity crisis in 2023. Traditionally a run-heavy team with Luke Fickell coming in to replace Paul Chryst, they became a more pro-style offense, which took a lot to get adjusted to. Tanner Mordecai didn't have the best season coming in from Cincinnati, and they went 7-6 overall and 5-4 in the Big Ten. Not the worst, but certainly not what you're looking for as a Wisconsin fan who is used to 8 or 9 wins a year. However, they do return over 71% of their production from 2023, according to ESPN. They were 23rd overall in recruiting for the 2024 cycle, according to 24/7 Sports. And with the first year under his belt, Luke Fickell is probably going to have a much more stable offense. You can expect there to be some kind of jump, especially now that they bring in former Miami quarterback Tyler Van Dyke, who of course is very controversial in that he's been very up and down throughout his career. He's shown flashes, don't get me wrong. He can be a great quarterback in the right system, and I think that changes scenery for both people, with Wisconsin moving on from Mordecai and Van Dyke moving on from Miami. I think that changes scenery will be mutually beneficial. Van Dyke has shown that he can be a reliable quarterback, and I think in a Luke Fickell offense, he could be set up for success. And their schedule is very unorthodox. They play Western Michigan and South Dakota at home in preparation for Alabama, who they get at home. And usually we would chalk that up as a almost certain loss. But with Nick Saban gone at Alabama, it is not entirely impossible that Wisconsin goes in and upsets Alabama at home. That by itself could cause a giant whirlwind of chaos in the sport. But after that, they still have Purdue, Penn State, Oregon, and Minnesota. And on the road, they face Southern Cal, Rutgers, Northwestern, Iowa, and Nebraska. So they're going to have an uphill battle with the schedule. It is not favorable, but the worst of the worst in terms of scheduling is at home for Wisconsin, which could prove to be an advantage as Wisconsin has a very good home field environment at Camp Randall Stadium. And like I said, with Luke Fickell in year 2 there, they could be poised to take a great step forward and maybe upset some of those Penn States, Oregon's, Alabama's, and potentially shake up the Big Ten standings, as Michigan, of course, is going to lose a lot of what they had last year. The former Pac-12 schools having to make the jump might not be as good as they were last year. Those teams could take a step back, having to adjust to the Big Ten. And it's very possible Wisconsin goes into the Big Ten this year a heavy underdog and comes out in the top 3 in the Big Ten in terms of record. Like I said, they will have a major uphill battle to get there, but don't count them out. Wisconsin is our second fire starter. And with our last fire starter, we're going to have the West Virginia Mountaineers. Now, funny story, I actually had no idea West Virginia had such a raucous Twitter fan base, and I had the pleasure of talking with a lot of them. They might have the strongest Twitter fan base of any college football team in 2024, and they believe in Neil Brown, and I'll have to say I do as well. West Virginia was a kind of middling team for the past few years under Brown. Last year, they take a big step forward and go 9-4. Now, a lot of their wins weren't pretty. They went 6-3 in the Big 12, but they lost big in a couple of those games. But late into the season, they started clicking really well. They beat North Carolina in the bowl game, and that could carry on into 2024. You have to like the momentum they generated, and they look like a different team late than they did going into the season and into the middle of the season. And they're going to return 70% of their production from 2023. According to ESPN, they lose some depth in the portal, but they potentially added much needed defensive starters. Defensively, West Virginia wasn't very consistent, but they're going to add defensive lineman TJ Jackson from Troy, safety TJ Crandall from Colorado State, and linebacker Reed Carrico from Ohio State. All 3 of those people are projected starters for the 2024 season, and they should add a much needed boost for that defense. And like our other 2 teams, they're going to have a very home-lenient schedule. At home, they take on Penn State, Albany, Kansas, Iowa State, Kansas State, Baylor, UCF. Now, other than Oklahoma State and Arizona, which they will face on the road, a lot of those teams are going to be their toughest opponents, and they get to face them at home. Penn State is huge. I believe they take them on in the first week of the season. And why not have week 1 as the week where you really drum up the chaos? If West Virginia can beat Penn State in week 1, I think they can beat any team on their schedule. Now, the likelihood of them going 12-0 is, of course, very low. But seeing how they ended the 2023 season, it's very likely they come in and upset a few teams. They're not going to be favored in a lot of these games, but that's why they are a fire starter. On the road, they're going to take on Pitt, Oklahoma State, Arizona, Cincinnati, and Texas Tech. Not the worst away schedule. And like the other 2 teams, they're going to be facing an uphill battle. But going in to 2024, I have a lot of faith in Neil Brown and West Virginia. Maybe not as much faith as the West Virginia fans on Twitter, but a good amount nonetheless. Now for our last segment of the episode, our first 2024 season preview, and it's going to be Florida State. Now, Florida State was one of the biggest stories last year, going 12-0, losing Jordan Travis late and then, of course, being left out of the playoff. That was one of the saddest possible endings for a team that we've seen in recent memory. They go on and get crushed by Georgia in the bowl game. Not entirely their fault. They lost a lot of guys to the draft and to the transfer portal before the game, and they should be back with a vengeance in 2024. Now, their key additions on offense are going to be DJ Uiagalelei, formerly of Clemson and Oregon State. In 2023, he had over 2,600 passing yards, 21 touchdowns, 7 interceptions, and an 81 QBR. Those stats don't jump off the paper when you hear them, but he was very efficient, and with better skill position talent at Florida State, he could be even better. You add a guy like Malik Benson from Alabama, who didn't get a lot of snaps, had 13 receptions for 160 yards, 1 touchdown, and 12.5 yards per reception. And speaking of Alabama, Florida State just piled on the Alabama transfers when Nick Saban left. They bring in Roydell Williams, running back from Alabama, who had over 100 carries for 560 yards, 5 touchdowns, and 5 yards per carry. Offensive lineman Terrence Ferguson for Alabama. He started in 4 games for the Crimson Tide last year. And on defense, they get Sean Murphy from Alabama, Marvin Jones Jr., defensive lineman from Georgia, defensive back Earl Little Jr. from Alabama, and defensive back Devontae Brown from Miami. They're bringing in a lot of guys, but they also lose a lot of guys to the portal and to the NFL. The biggest ones are defensive linemen Jared Verse and Braden Fisk, wide receivers Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson, and of course quarterback Jordan Travis. You're losing a lot of production, but you're bringing in guys who can fill those roles. They have the ability, they have the talent. And as long as Mike Norvell is your head coach at Florida State, there should be no problems. Mike Norvell is amazing at developing talent, bringing in guys from the portal and from high school and having them make an impact sooner rather than later. Now, the keys to success for Florida State in 2024 are going to be maintaining your identity, and that means keeping the main focus of the team as the defense. With Jordan Travis last year, the offense was very good to great at times, but the defense determined every game last year. Think back to LSU, Clemson, Florida, Louisville. When Jordan Travis went out in those last couple games against Florida and Louisville, the defense is what won those games, and it wasn't close. The backups for Florida State couldn't really get it together, and despite that, the defense kept them in those games, and they won the ACC championship in an ugly defensive battle with Louisville. So if you're Norvell, you're going to stick with what you know and with what has worked so far, and that is a defensive-minded team with a good offense that hopefully won't make very many mistakes. And with that, the next key for success is going to be letting DJ be DJ. Now, if you're a Florida State fan, give DJ some leeway. He's not going to be Jordan Travis. He's not going to come in and wow you like Travis could. He's not going to be an incredible athlete. He's not going to be a Heisman candidate, most likely. Now, he could take a massive step forward from his years at Clemson and Oregon State and be a top quarterback in the conference, but he is a very capable starter when given the tools necessary to succeed, and Florida State has already provided him with that. He's not going to cost you games, but he might not go out and win you every game. But like we said, with a defensive-centered team and a good enough quarterback who's not going to lose you games, they could go out and go undefeated again. Now, that's going to be tough with the schedule they have. At home, they face Boston College, Memphis, who should be a really good Group of 5 team. Don't sleep on Memphis, Cal, Clemson, North Carolina, Charleston Southern, and Florida. And then on the road, they face Georgia Tech and Ireland. And those Ireland games can be scary, very unpredictable usually. SMU, like we talked about earlier, Duke, Miami, and Notre Dame. That schedule is tough. And with the talent level that Florida State has been accustomed to under Mike Norvell, they should be favored in most, if not all of those games. Notre Dame should be really good. We'll have to wait and see how that one shakes out. But either way, not the friendliest schedule if you're Florida State. But if you're Mike Norvell, why not go out and prove everybody wrong? In your eyes, you got robbed of a playoff spot last year. So why not come out in 2024 with a vengeance and potentially win the ACC? Now, for the final grade and the outlook for Florida State, on offense, we're going to give them an 87. These rankings are out of 100, of course. A high B on offense. They lose a lot of guys. They lose a lot of production in Travis, Wilson, and Coleman. And while the guys they replace them with are good, I believe personally they took a bit of a step backward, which isn't the end of the world when the defense is your focal point. And with that, the defense is going to get a 92 grade, a low A. The defense did take a step back from last year. It is uncertain if they will be as good as they were, but they did add a lot of talent there to fulfill those needs. It should be a very solid unit once again. And speaking of very solid, the coaching department is going to get a 96. Norvell's staff has experienced very little turnover. And when you've proven you can go undefeated in the conference and undefeated across the entire regular season, it's hard not to be ranked as one of the best coaching staffs in the nation. I believe there are better, so he's not going to get the A+, but a 96 is great either way. And for strength of schedule, while it is difficult, it is not the worst in the country. It is going to get a low A 93. The biggest games to watch there are most likely going to be Clemson at home and Notre Dame on the road. And that's going to give Florida State a 92 overall heading into the 2024 season. Overall, probably a little bit worse than they were in 2023, but not by that much. And for their ceiling in terms of record, they could go undefeated again. Now, later in the offseason, we'll get specific with what we believe the conference outlook will be. But as for ceiling alone, Florida State has shown they're capable of going undefeated, and I'm not going to say that any games on their schedule are a confirmed loss, especially this early in the offseason. We're still in April. We've got a long way to go. Things could change, but as of right now, their ceiling is undefeated, with their floor being 9-3 and 7-2 in the conference. Those two games that I highlighted earlier are their biggest worries, and they could drop another game if things go wrong. Overall, not too bad. Florida State should be one of the better teams in the country and in the ACC, and that is going to wrap up their season preview. Thank you for listening or watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to hit like and subscribe. Also, if you have a team that you would like to see get previewed next, feel free to drop it in the comment section or go to O&O Sports on Twitter and leave a comment there with what team you would like to see next. And be sure to tune in next week. You will not have to wait another 2 weeks for an upload on the channel. There will be a new video up next week. It will not be an episode of the O&O Show, but it will be a new series that we're starting on the channel. So be on the lookout for that. And thank you for watching the O&O Show. I've been your host, Colton Fetter, at Volton Fetter on all social medias, and we will see you in the next episode.